So tonight, I want to talk about how globalists treat the entire planet like their own personal testing ground. However, experimenting on the masses isn't anything new. There's a rich, if not slightly terrifying history of this stuff. We've all heard about the infamous ones like the Tuskegee experiments or MK Ultra, but let's not forget about the lesser-known gems like the Point Saint incident, where the CIA decided it would be fun to see what happens when you dose an entire French village with LSD, because yeah, why not? And then in 1950, we have Operation Sea Spray, where the government thought, hey, why not poison San Francisco with bacteria to simulate a future biological attack? And then we have a ton of prison experiments, and that one time, they decided to serve up radioactive oatmeal to children. And yeah, you might be thinking, that one can't be true. But it is true. They did that. But to be honest, we're just scratching the surface with all that stuff. However, that brings me to point number 2. Governments are still experimenting on the masses. From medical interventions that make you question your last doctor's visit, to psychological operations that might make you think twice about your own perception of reality, to messing with ecosystems, and of course, playing God with genetics and transhumanism. Yeah, it's almost as if they're trying to speedrun different ways to turn our reality into some sci-fi dystopia. However, these experiments aren't always as blatant as dosing a village with LSD, or spraying bacteria over an entire freaking city. Sometimes the experimentation is subtle, and woven into the very fabric of policy and governance. And it's true, governments often test out policy implementation, as if it's a controlled experiment. Think about it like this. They introduce a new policy in one region or country, and then watch, analyze, and learn from the outcomes. It's like a large-scale laboratory where the population is the subject. For instance, economic policies, social initiatives, or new legislative measures can be seen as trials. They test out the public response, economic impact, and social behavior without the overt consent or awareness of the population. It's a quiet kind of experiment, where the variables are laws, taxes, health mandates, or whatever the case may be, and the results are measured in economic stability, public health, or social unrest. This approach allows them to refine their strategies, adapt their control mechanisms, or even justify further interventions based on quote-unquote data-driven decisions. Whether it's through the pilot program for universal basic income, changes in environmental regulations, or shifts in educational systems, these policies are experiments in real time, with real people as the data points. So, with that said, let's dive into how they test drive their technocratic policies. In general, I believe I can make an argument that we've been in one big experiment for the last decade. It's the Davos method, really. Each step of their global agenda goes through an incubation period. They test out new policies in a country, gather the data, tweak their approach, and then get ready to unleash it on the rest of us. Just take Sri Lanka for an example. It was acting as kind of like a petri dish for the World Economic Forum's Agenda 2030. They had their Davos puppet as a leader, trying to overhaul everything to fit this grand plan. And what happened? Well, everyone got real pissed about it and revolted. So after the coup, the World Economic Forum installed yet another Davos puppet. And predictably, they just continued moving forward with the plan. And how did it go, you ask? Well, it went terribly. Here's one headline from 2021. To avoid default, Sri Lanka might need to get tougher on climate change. And then 1 year later, here's what life looks like in a country that ran out of fuel. Well, shit. That escalated quickly. But let's not forget about Canada or the Netherlands with their nitrogen cutbacks. It was a part of their war on farming, as you know. But Sri Lanka was actually the guinea pig for this nitrogen cap too. They introduced a new type of fertilizer to address it, which, instead of boosting crops, actually tanked their yield by over 80%. And they almost didn't recover from it at all. Really though, I think they knew exactly what was going to happen before they even started. And by pushing these policies worldwide, even after establishing proof of failure, well, there's no excuse. It feels like they're setting the world up for catastrophe and setting the stage for manufactured food shortages. And it feels like that because that's exactly what they're doing. But here's another before and after from the World Economic Forum. How we will make Sri Lanka rich by 2025. A couple years later, why Sri Lanka is facing one of its worst economic crises. I mean, damn. At this point, failure is the only thing Davos does consistently, right? But of course, this isn't just happening in Sri Lanka, it's a global phenomenon. Everywhere you look, another globalist experiment is unfolding, and it's been going on for years. So back in 2020, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Australia were the testing grounds for draconian lockdowns. We saw some of the most over-the-top police responses there, and it wasn't accidental or just a personality defect in their leadership. Although that definitely had something to do with it, my point is that it was by design. Basically, they wanted to find out how much freedom they could take away before people snapped, and at the same time, they were planting the seed for climate lockdowns too.
Are actually young global leaders of the world economic forum. We penetrate the cabinets. The change is not just happening. The change can be shaped by us. We have to prepare for a more angry world. How to prepare? Take the necessary action to create a fairer world. I see the need for a great reset. So people assume we are just going back to the good old world which we had, and everything will be normal again. This is, let's say, fiction. It will not happen.
There is only one way this pandemic is going to go. It's going to get worse and worse and worse.
The next crisis is already waiting for us around the corner, and it is the climate crisis.
Yeah, it kind of served a dual purpose. As we've talked about before, they use circular tactics and hit you from all sides. But it's even more than that, because they set up the next phase as you're dealing with the fallout from the first one. That way you're constantly on your heels and have no solid footing. Perpetual chaos, perpetual uncertainty. Now, regarding New Zealand, at the time they even admitted they were building a two-tiered society based on compliance. And it kind of sounds to me that Jacinda Ardern was playing The Sims, but with real people.
So you basically see this is going to be like, well, it's almost like, you probably don't see it like this, the two different classes of people. If you're vaccinated or if you're unvaccinated, you have all these rights. If you are vaccinated...
That is what it is, so yep.
Now Australia is still all in on the global agenda. They're pushing ahead with CBDCs and digital ID like there's no tomorrow. Yeah, basically they're building a surveillance state that would make Orwell blush.
It's quite a terrifying bill in front of Parliament as we speak, and that is the Digital ID Bill.
Say hello to Australia's digital ID system. It's a straightforward, safer way of verifying who you are online, putting you in control of your information and providing a secure and convenient way to access online services.
There really is an almost global push towards getting the West and other countries signed up to a system of digital identification.
Ontario's digital IDs will be launching later this year.
Digital identity wallets, it's an European tool.
So what's being talked about is a digital ID.
Anda mesti ada dengar pasal identity digital national kan?
And we've seen this come out. This is the language of places like the World Economic Forum.
Digital identity is increasingly the cornerstone of how we engage in society.
There is obviously tremendous energy building around this concept of digital identity.
The overall principle of it is that it seeks to set up a system whereby Australians are offered the opportunity to be part of a digital framework.
Putting you in control of your information and providing a secure and convenient way to access online services.
Which you can then use to interact with business and with government.
My rates, my tax, my tolls, my healthcare, my welfare, my gas, my electricity, my bills, my banking, eventually virtually everything can be in my digital ID.
We are creating a framework whereby the government and this system becomes central to everything you do. Problem with that is framed in what we saw during COVID.
We're going to move to a situation where, to protect the health system, we're going to lock out people who are not vaccinated.
Obvious thing to move in the direction of digital ID.
At the moment, it's all voluntary. And we're told it's voluntary.
If you're an individual, you will not have to have one of these digital ID.
Once the framework's in place, it's not that difficult to amend bills to make it completely compulsory.
The government's position on COVID-19 vaccinations is that it is voluntary.
The vaccine mandate has kicked in.
This gives government the opportunity to turn you on or off, whether you are naughty or nice. Imagine needing to go to hospital and needing to use your Medicare, but not having, having been a holdout for digital ID. Well, perhaps you just don't go to hospital. And we might all laugh at that, but that's basically what we saw during COVID.
There are an untold number who are being denied these life-saving organ transplants because of their vaccination status.
Sheila Annette Lewis has died after she was refused an organ transplant because she refused the COVID vaccination.
And this is the framework we're setting up with this bill here. And it looks like the government are going to ram it through without debate. And the ramifications are huge. Imagine plugging this into a central bank digital currency and plugging it into data from surveillance. You give yourself a turnkey society potentially whereby people can just be cancelled. And we saw that in Canada with the truckers.
Banks have already started to freeze the accounts of people involved in the protests.
If your truck is being used in these protests, your corporate accounts will be frozen.
And if you want to look into the dystopian future, have a look at what China are doing, where people can be deducted from their bank account for jaywalking because the camera saw them, they have a digital ID, and their WeChat bank account just gets deducted without them even doing anything. We're not that far off that. That is where these things potentially lead if we're not careful.
So why not join some of the millions of people already verifying their ID through Australia's digital ID system?
Those three nations, Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, their government policies are a masterclass in totalitarianism. And the same thing goes for the UK, but we'll get to them in a second. Now let's talk about the mass immigration experiment currently wreaking havoc across the Western world, from the US to Spain, France, Ireland, Italy, the UK, and way beyond. They have been conducting a live experiment in open borders and seeing if they can force global hegemony. The grand plan? I don't know. To blend everyone into a smoothie of global citizenship by erasing national identities, I guess. That's also why we're seeing these linguistic manipulations too. Gone are the days when you were just a citizen of your respected nation. Now they want you to think of yourself as a global citizen. Yeah, that's not a coincidence, it's intentional and by design. Anyway, here's the UK Prime Minister admitting that the immigration plan has been one big experiment.
What the British people are owed is an explanation. Because a failure on this scale isn't just bad luck, it isn't a global trend or taking your eye off the ball. No, this is a different order of failure. This happened by design, not accident. Policies were reformed deliberately to liberalise immigration. Brexit was used for that purpose, to turn Britain into a one-nation experiment in open borders. Global Britain. Remember that slogan? That is what they meant. A policy with no support, and which they then pretended wasn't happening.
In fact, the UK has become their favorite playground for all sorts of experiments. At first, the Netherlands was ground zero for their plot to take over food systems. The locals are still fighting back. But after they showed Mark Rutte the door, the globalists turned their gaze to the UK, which was a hot topic at COP29, by the way. But it's not just about snatching family farms and gobbling up private land. Their little experiments include mass censorship, thought crimes, the construction of 15-minute cities, mass surveillance with facial recognition and those ULEZ camera systems. I mean, all of that is still in play. And trust me, they're watching to see how the populace reacts to these, societal shake-ups, if you will. They've been pretty busy, that's for sure. And on top of that, it's like they've been playing a game of musical chairs with World Economic Forum puppets for Prime Minister. From Rishi Sunak to Liz Truss, all the way to Starmer.
Our country needs a bigger reset.
We need a great reset.
Let us just ask you quickly, you have to choose now between Davos or Westminster?
Davos.
Why?
Because Westminster is too constrained. And, it's closed and we're not having meaning. Once you get out of Westminster, whether it's Davos or anywhere else, you actually engage with people that you can see working with in the future. Westminster is just a tribal shouting place.
And let's not forget Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, who is also all in on the action. He's a Davos devotee, and he manages the global C40 Smart City Plan, essentially building that digital cage.
The 15-minute cities is something that the WEF has created called C40, and it's called C40 Cities. I would urge you to certainly look on the internet about it, and then go to all of the TikTokers and see what they're really saying. Basically, you won't be able to drive a petrol or diesel car anymore. You'll have to buy electric. If you want food, you will get a calorie-controlled system sent to you by text saying, this is what you can eat today. This is what you can have today. If you violate any of these things, they'll freeze your bank account. That is the next step. These are stages in which they're going to implement this stuff. And this was signed up by the WEF, and the WEF has signed up with our mayor in London as the chair. And he has gone around the world to communicate this C40 to all of the countries in the world. And most of the countries are looking at adopting it. Now, I am going to abolish it. It is a hopeless position. We are going to be in an open prison, or shall we say a COVID, for the rest of our lives. We will not be able to work unless it's in our 15-minute city. It's diabolical. It's not this is not the right thing. And it's been hidden from the public. No one's talking about it.
As I've mentioned, this isn't just a UK thing either. It's a global game. Always remember that.
What is the C40 City Group, and why would they distance themselves from these claims?
And so why did you decide to enter into a global pact?
I think that the goals that C40 has set for the world are really important goals if we're going to mitigate climate change.
According to their website, C40 City Climate Change Leadership Group is a group of 96 cities represented by mayors around the world, representing 1/12 of the world's population and 1/4 of the global economy, focused on fighting the climate crisis and driving urban action to reduce green gas emissions. End quote. Quietly plowing in the seeds of the UN Agenda 2030 with the aid of Silicon Valley towards a more equitable digitization of the workplace with exponential growth of a cloud-based government.
What we have to do as politicians is to almost be like teachers, work with the experts to explain, just like we do with the pandemic, explain climate change.
Rumors were swirling last month. 14 cities in the United States are planning to ban meat. The news made its rounds mostly on conservative news websites. The Federalist reported that the plan for 2030 outlines some very ambitious goals. These include zero consumption of meat, zero consumption of dairy, 3 new clothes items per year per person, 0 private vehicle ownership, and 1 short return airline flight per person once every 3 years. Close to 100 cities have signed on to the deal. In the United States, this includes Austin, Boston, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, Miami, New Orleans, New York City, Philadelphia, Phoenix, Portland, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Seattle. It's all part of the C40 Cities program. In October 2019, it declared on its website, 14 cities commit to sustainable food policies that will address the global climate emergency. And it alleges that eating a sustainable diet and avoiding food waste could cut greenhouse gas emissions from the food we eat by more than 60%. This was all part of what it called the Planetary Health Diet, which it claimed could save 11 million lives each year if adopted universally. And it says as well that mayors will work with their citizens to achieve a planetary health diet for all by 2030. And it's not some big secret either. The C40 Cities program has all the cities involved globally listed publicly on its website. And many of these cities have actively been involved in passing legislation in line with this agenda. So despite what the fact checkers say, this agenda is very much real.
And for another example, here's Yuval Harari, the unofficial prophet of Davos. And he's talking about how they use Israel as their testing ground for mass surveillance and population control. Yeah, they're basically beta testing the future right before our very eyes.
And all you need in order to systematically hack millions of people is just the data. Mm-hmm. That to hack people means to know people better than they know themselves. Right. To somebody in San Francisco, in Beijing, knows you, knows more about you than you know about yourself, about your medical condition, about your mental weaknesses, things that you did 5 years ago, 20 years ago, you completely forgot about them, they know it.
Right.
This is something we never faced before. Not even the KGB could do it.
Right.
And if we allow this kind of data to be accumulated by a few corporations or governments, the result will be really the end of democracy in the free market.
Yeah.
And the creation of new kinds of totalitarian regimes, or total surveillance regimes, in which somebody knows you better and can therefore manipulate you, and can therefore predict what everything you're going to do.
Yeah.
And we are already beginning to see the emergence of such total surveillance regimes in places like Xinjiang, in places like in my own home country in Israel. We have this big laboratory of surveillance called the Occupied Territories, where you have 2.5 million guinea pigs of how to completely survey and control a population with very few soldiers. I mean, when you look at the numbers, it's amazing how few soldiers you need to control millions of people if you have their data.
Now, I don't know if he's talking about Israeli citizens or the Palestinian population. Probably both. Either way, it's dark and twisted. But we don't stop there. Recently, Bill Gates was bragging about using India as his personal testing ground for global initiatives. They experiment there, tweak it, and then get ready to roll it out like a new software update to the rest of the world. And India has their own Davos devotee and their leader, Modi, who is more than willing to offer up his citizens on a silver platter.
Well, when India's an example of a country where, there's plenty of things that are difficult there. The health, nutrition, education is improving, and they're stable enough and generating their own government revenue enough that it's very likely that 20 years from now, people will be dramatically better off. And it's kind of a laboratory to try things that then, once you prove them out in India, you can take to other places. And so our biggest non-US office for the foundation is in India, and the most number of pilot rollout things we're doing anywhere in the world are with partners in India. If you go there and you've never been, you might think, whoa, this is a chaotic place. And you're not used to so many levels of income all being on the street at the same time, but you will get a sense of the vibrancy.
Some of the programs that have been tested there include everything from digital ID to medication trials and more. India is all in on this global lab project. So I threw in some historical examples in the beginning to go alongside these recent ones, because I don't think the experimentation train is slowing down anytime soon. With an agenda that's been cooking for over 50 years and trillions of dollars at stake, what would they do to keep their infinite money glitch rolling? Given the context and knowing how far these governments have gone in the past, well, I wouldn't put anything past them. Which brings us to point number 3. The establishment realized that pandemics can be wielded like a political weapon. Think along the lines of 2020. And really, they might just do it again, because a crisis like that can be manipulated in many, many ways. From locking down society to push through a new economic system to using it to control political opposition, and they could even use it to hobble an incoming administration. All of that seems clear to me, and probably to most of you too. But would they really go that far? Well, keep in mind, they've got big plans for 2030, and those plans are currently on life support. So yeah, as I said, I wouldn't put it past them. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because I recently came across a clip of Dr. Peter Hotez, and he had some predictions that piqued my interest, and this is actually the clip that caused me to make this entire video. As you watch this, listen for the moment where he claims to know the exact date when new pathogens are going to make their debut on the world stage.
Here's the reason why we need to care about this stuff, Nicole, is that we have some big picture stuff coming down the pike starting on January 21st. Mr. Bloomberg mentioned H5N1. That I'm really worried about. It's all over wild birds on the western part of the United States and going up in the north. It's getting into the poultry. We're seeing sporadic human cases, no human-to-human transmission yet, but that could happen. It's in the cattle, it's in the milk, and that's just the beginning. We have another major coronavirus likely brewing in Asia. We've had SARS in 2002, SARS-2, COVID-19 in 2019. And we know these viruses are jumping from bats to people thousands of times a year. But there's still more. We know that we have a big problem with mosquito-transmitted viruses all along the Gulf Coast, where I am here in Texas. So we're expecting dengue and possibly Zika virus coming back, or a Puche virus, maybe even yellow fever. And there's more. Then we have all this sharp rise in vaccine-preventable diseases going up because of, in part, the anti-vaccine activism that's so prominent right now. We have a 5-fold rise in pertussis cases, whooping cough over the last year, 15 measles outbreaks this year. We've got polio that's been in the wastewater in New York State. All that's going to come crashing down on January 21st on the Trump administration. We need a really, really good team to be able to handle this.
Yeah, so Dr. Peter Hotez claims that the U.S. will face a wave of deadly viruses starting conveniently on January 21st, 2025, right after Trump's inauguration. From bird flu to new coronaviruses, he warns it's all going to come crashing down on the new administration. I mean, how do you know the exact date of it dropping, huh? Interestingly, the last time one of these pandemic guys predicted chaos for Trump, well, it came true. And for that, let's go to Anthony Fauci in January of 2017.
There will be a surprise outbreak. Given, as you heard from the introduction, that I have been around for a while and have had the opportunity and the privilege and the pleasure of serving in 5 administrations, I thought I would bring that perspective to the topic today, is the issue of pandemic preparedness. And if there's one message that I want to leave with you today based on my experience, and you'll see that in a moment, is that there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases, both chronic infectious diseases in the sense of already ongoing disease, and we have certainly a large burden of that, but also there will be a surprise outbreak, and I hope by the end of...
Damn, how did he know that Trump was going to deal with a pandemic 2 years before it happened? Some might call that odd. But it's really not that odd if you assume the establishment figured out that pandemics are the ultimate political weapon. And on top of that, they've already proven that you can use a health crisis to trip up an incoming administration. Picture the classic banana peel in a cartoon. Yeah, that type of deal. So do I think it's out of the realm of possibility for the US establishment to try it again? Nope. Which is why I take stories like this one very seriously. And I quote, "The Australian government announced that hundreds of deadly virus samples are missing in what they're calling a major historical breach of biosecurity protocols. And this happened back in August of 2023, but they're only telling us about it right now, which is pretty weird. But yeah, they say that 323 vials of live viruses are now unaccounted for. These include nearly 100 vials of Hendra virus, 2 vials of hantavirus, and 223 vials of lyssavirus, all of which are extremely deadly to humans." End of quote. Now, I think people underestimate what's at stake for the globalist class. We're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars and a complete reshuffling of power, and that's nothing to sniff at. For years, they've entangled government functions with the private sector like a giant bureaucratic spiderweb, and it acts as kind of like a form of protection. It's a tangled web of corruption and deeply entrenched bureaucracy. Untangling it would be an almost impossible feat, but it is possible, and it seems to be happening via the Department of Government Efficiency. So, in desperate times, what would they do to cling to power? As I've said many times already, I wouldn't be surprised about anything, really. For example, as RFK Jr. looms in the shadows waiting to cut entire departments and reshape the health sector, well, on the opposite side of that spectrum, we have Big Pharma, the FDA, and the CDC scrambling to prove their worth. And what's the best way to prove their worth? Well, you could have another crisis and then make people depend on you again. Sounds about right to me. But it's all about fear. That's their bread and butter. The ultimate manipulation move. Tried and true tactics. Fear is always a powerful reminder. They use it all the time. Big Pharma, the FDA, CDC, etc., they're no different. But it's not just about money or control. It's even darker than that. So they have these Disease X simulations, and every time they liken the pandemic to a wartime scenario, where they can control society from top to bottom. This ability comes from what they deem to be emergency powers. You know, we've all heard the saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. But I contend that they got sick of waiting for each new crisis, and decided it was time to start creating them. As a way to fast-track their agenda, basically. And I was trying to find a good analogy for all of that, and the only thing I could think of was comparing it to a TV show. So, if you consider global policy as the script itself, then every crisis is kind of like an individual episode. The plot twist comes in the form of those emergency powers. But all of it is just to build you up to that season finale and resolve all the conflicts from prior episodes. The conclusion to their sci-fi dystopian saga would be global government and no freedom, but pitched as a sort of utopian resolution where everyone lives happily ever after. And yeah, everybody would be very disappointed with that freaking show. The show writers would be getting lit up in the comments on social media, no doubt about that. Now, I'm still working on that analogy, but you know, that's the best I got, so there you go. Anyway, they have these economic plans stretching to 2050, aiming for a new global monetary system. And these emergency powers are their excuse to fast-track this economic transition. Interestingly, around 2014, when the phrase the Great Reset was coined, their focus shifted to crisis management. And how convenient. That's actually what got me thinking about the TV show analogy, but yeah, that's neither here nor there. Because it really feels like they have a script for global policy, and every crisis is just an episode in their series, all leading towards one conclusion, one date, 2030. Their predictions for calamity from pandemics to climate change, they always use that 2030 target. And magically, that 2030 date is always listed for their economic proposals too. It's like they have a calendar with one date circled in red, over and over and over. Some might say it's a coincidence, but in this game, I doubt it. I know I've already shown this clip before in different videos, but once again, here's Peter Hotez with predictions for chaos by 2030.
We know what's next. We're going to have another major coronavirus pandemic before the end of this decade, before 2030. We're going to have zoonotic influenza illness. We're going to have arboviruses, mosquito-transmitted viruses, because of that combination of climate change. We're seeing that now on the Gulf Coast. So, put your tray tables in the upright position and your seats forward and your seatbelts on, because this is unfortunately a new wave of pandemics is going to be upon us because of that combination of 21st century forces of climate change and urbanization and human migrations.
So yeah, it's crazy. These predictions of disasters aligning with our economic timelines is not a coincidence. It serves a dual purpose too. Now this one's going to be a little tough to explain, as it revolves around governance, or the philosophy behind governance, if you will. And it has its roots in human psychology. So, how do you manage millions or hundreds of millions of people during upheaval? How do you keep them relatively calm while drastic changes are happening all around them? How do you keep them engaged in commerce and ensure that society still functions? Because if you think about it, society is like an ecosystem. One break in the chain and the bottom could fall out, right? So here's the question. How do you induce a collapse while still maintaining control over everybody and keep society from imploding entirely? It's a very, very fine line to walk, but I believe you could accomplish this by providing a narrative of inevitable chaos. And it's even better if it's in the form of an act of God, like pandemics or climate change. The reason is because these scenarios are perceived as uncontrollable. It justifies the state's tighter control and their demands for social compliance. The narrative goes something like this. This crisis is beyond our control, but by adhering to these new rules and making personal sacrifices, we can navigate through this difficult time together for a better future. You know what I mean? It's almost a hopeful and reassuring message to the normies, right? It perfectly explains why freedoms might be curtailed and why drastic changes are necessary. It gives the public a reason for the disruption, a justification for government action, and a hopeful vision of recovery, ensuring that the economic transition can proceed under the guise of collective survival. You see, people need to know the reason as to why their world is falling apart. They need to have a reason as to why the government is lacing up their boots and getting ready to stomp on their face. And they have to, at the very least, see the light at the end of the tunnel, otherwise no one's going to comply. So it does all that and at the same time provides the vehicle for massive economic change. It's pretty clever, isn't it? But I just can't get over it. Isn't it curious how the doomsday forecasts, be it pandemics or climate change, always sync up so neatly with their economic timeline? It's always 2030, no matter what, no matter the context. I don't know. An extraordinary coincidence, right? Well, not so fast, because on the other hand, the establishment just discovered that pandemics can serve as their sword and shield. And mark my words, they might wield it again. Because a crisis like that can be twisted in a myriad of ways, from cloaking society in lockdowns to birth a new economic order, for example. But beyond that, a crisis like that could be used to stifle dissent, to checkmate political rivals, or to hobble a new administration before they even start. Because let's face it, their grand 2030 vision seems to be slipping through their fingers. It's all a little too clear, isn't it? As I've said, pretty clever too. Evil, but clever. Anyway, to end the video, I'll leave you with this. Keep your eyes wide and your mind open, and don't let them break you. The world has faced its share of dark times, yet from each, we come out the other side with a renewed understanding of freedom, resilience, and the human spirit. Remember, stay vigilant, but also be hopeful. For in the end, it's our collective wisdom, courage, and our demands for freedom that will chart the course beyond 2030, towards a future in which we, not they, decide our destiny. I do hope you all have a great Christmas, and I'll talk to you soon. Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals, or you could use PayPal. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas, and yes, I do hope you have a good night.